Mrs. Kate at the Library of Whispers. I'm going to do something that I haven't done for a while. We're going to have a browse through this BBC History magazine. So I'm going to browse and I may do a bit of reading. I quite like this article, which is the headline, "What was the worst year in British history?" Question mark. I'm also going to do something else. We're going to chew some gum at the same time. Now I know this is a love or hate moment. Some of you really find this relaxing, and for some it's an utter turn off, so I do apologise if you are in that category. I tend to do most of my gum chewing content on my second channel. Oops. So if you like that, pop along to my second channel, which is just simply called Library of Whispers 2. I have no imagination. Okay. 2 pieces of gum. So this is an old magazine from February 2008. Long time ago. So we've got a contents page. On page 23, the article I'm interested in, "The worst years in British history." Derek Wilson selects the 5 most terrible years to have lived through in Britain since Roman times. And then we've got an article on King Alfred the Great. An article on the Cold War cover-up. Sporting war heroes. France's Algerian shame. also had to be wary of events that historians have dubbed important, that's in inverted commas. The arrival of William of Orange to expel James II in 1688 was the last successful invasion of our shores, and was pregnant with political consequences. But how was it perceived by the majority of contemporaries? Did they really care very much who wore the crown in distant Westminster? That, for me, was the crucial point. What years saw such a concatenation of disastrous events that most people were driven to despair? Having very subjectively, of course, compiled a short list of mini années horribles. I use the term year loosely because events and movements do not fit conveniently into calendar units. Just for fun, I decided to select a winner. My judge's choice in the box on page 28 will probably surprise many readers and irritate a few, but I hope it will provoke all into reflecting further on what it was like to live through crisis years. The human race, and our particular chunk of it, is remarkably resilient, and focusing attention on times that have seen us at our lowest ebb also highlights our ability to overcome catastrophe and pluck hope from the jaws of despair. So we start with AD 60. Rome stamps down on the British rebels. When Nero became emperor in AD 54, he seriously considered withdrawing his legions from Britain. The Roman conquest of the island had been underway for a decade and had been very heavy going. The tribes, sometimes acting in concert, had inflicted some humiliating defeats on Roman forces and were continuing to harass the invaders. An official divide and rule policy was not proving strikingly successful. Nero decided to strengthen the Roman invasion forcefully because, according to the historian Tacitus, he did not want to be outdone by his predecessor Claudius. His decision had a shattering effect on the people of Britain. Suetonius Paulinus, who was sent to lead the advance, was a no-nonsense soldier with a reputation for fighting in mountainous terrain. This was important because North Wales had been identified as the main centre of British resistance. Anglesey was the site of the principal Druidic shrine, a haven for fugitives and a source of anti-Roman propaganda. The Druids were drawn from the upper echelons of tribal society. They were scholars, priests, poets and judges who preserved and passed on ancient laws and legends. The concept of nationalism is anachronistic in first century Britain, but the Druids seem to have been a unifying force, providing a powerful ideological basis for resisting the alien Roman culture. The Druids had been a respected element of society for generations. For the AD 60 Britons, it must have seemed that the Druids had always been there. To strike at them, Suetonius knew, would be to demoralise the whole population. Tacitus has left a vivid description of the confrontation of cultures. The enemy was arrayed along the shore in a massive, dense, and heavily armed line of battle. Women dressed in black, like the Furies, were thrusting their way about in it. is almost inconceivable that the lords and ladies who celebrated at lavish banquets and tournaments could be unaware that all around them the social fabric was falling apart. They seem to have been as indifferent to the suffering of the people as most of us are to the impact of HIV/AIDS in Africa, even though, as the Italian writer Boccaccio observed, many whose claws could lash out against anyone. Anger and suspicion. He now showed that head of the church was no empty title. In March, an act was passed dissolving all religious houses with an annual income of less than £200, as well as the distress caused to the small communities of monks and nuns. Anger and suspicion were aroused among their neighbours, who suspected that this was the thin end of a land-grabbing wedge. Their suspicions deepened when commissioners were sent out to assess the wealth and spiritual condition of the remaining monasteries. Then, in July, Parliament passed into law what were ironically called Articles of Faith to establish Christian quietness. Among its clauses was one condemning superstitious and idolatrous practices. When Henry was warned that these measures would stir unrest, he responded by forbidding all preaching for 3 months, which closed the lid on boiling discontent. Feelings ran particularly high in the North and the East Midlands. The last straw was the arrival of the King's tax gatherers in September. Rumours spread that the officials had come to remove church treasures. In Lincolnshire, angry mobs, egged on by priests, raised the standard of revolt and took the King's men prisoner. The Lincolnshire rebellion was nipped in the bud by a show of force, but trouble had spread across the Humber, and most of the north was up in